I'd really like to thank the US Embassy mission here and WWF for their help in putting on this event and the roadshow. I'm going to give a brief
introduction to living shorelines that have multiple benefits. We and others identified those, and that was part of the President's task force report and recommendations that our center did with the help of local and state leaders, and tribal leaders too, because it's really going to take people working at all these different levels. Adaptation is a very place-based phenomenon. And as I mentioned, there's many roles that can be played by universities like ours and the state institutions. Public-private partnerships have been important, and indeed regional partnerships across agencies and across jurisdictions. In Southeast Florida, there's been a compact that's been very robust, even with changes in administrations coming and going, and even with different parties really working together to look at what the impacts are going to be to South Florida and how they can respond, trying to be on the same page about what the projections are going to look like. That's also happening in the West. With the Western Adaptation Alliance that we're working with on drought and other impacts on the western states, as well as some California regional collaboratives that are developing. As Alden mentioned, the administration is announcing some additional support for external collaborations, and we're hoping that there's also more support for internal collaborations in the U.S., but frankly, it's been a challenge because sometimes even giving support for adaptation at home is a difficult issue in Congress. When you say the word climate change, and you're adapting to that impact, sometimes these things get zeroed out of the budgets. So it is really a challenge, but I give the administration a lot of credit for using what authority and what funding they do have and really trying to orient the incentives in the right direction. The Coast Guard speech that the president made talks about the military impacts of climate change on readiness and on operations. We're looking forward to the Pope's visit and his encyclical this week and hoping that maybe that generates a little bit more political support from a broader base in the U.S. We're all watching for that. Of course, many of us are applauding the G7 and looking forward to the G20 discussions about this. One of the things that's been happening in the U.S. is divestment decisions, and even our university, Georgetown, thanks, I would say, to a student movement, is divesting from coal. That's a relatively new development. That's, of course, happening in European institutions as well. There's also national disaster resilience competition that is allowing some of the jurisdictions that have been affected by disasters to plan and envision together changes and to use the federal money from like HUD, the Housing and Urban Development money that comes to them, differently with climate change impacts in mind, with collaboration with the Rockefeller Foundation. So that's an interesting example of a public-private partnership between a philanthropy and the people on the ground, as well as using federal resources. And then finally, of course, we're looking forward to the Paris COP. And our center, because of our relationship with the states, will be bringing over governors, former governors, senior state officials to talk about both the impacts of climate change, but also to pivot, as they often do, to a message of hope, to a message of some of the changes that they're making on the ground that are investing in a clean energy economy and that are creating jobs and opportunities for their regions as well.
Question. So that is part of our strategy, is to, in a nonpartisan way, politicize the resilience issue and make it something that anyone who aspires to higher office has to have an intelligence response to. I should say the business community is also increasingly engaged. The Risky Business Report that came out last year, which looks at the range of consequences for each region of the U.S. and each economic sector in the U.S., is changing the conversation in business. The Center for Climate and Energy Solutions has also done very good work here, working with major multinationals about the business supply chain risk of climate change. And I think that's starting to change the perception in the business community, where traditionally you've had the large fossil fuel industry, the oil, the coal, the utilities, the railroads on one side, up against the very small renewable energy companies and a handful of others. And most of business is sort of sitting on the sidelines saying, we don't have a dog in this fight. What's our stake in it? Now they're starting to realize that climate impacts can be a fundamental risk to their business model, and that they do have a stake in this fight. And that's changing the politics over time as well. Finally, I'll just say a few things about the Obama administration. To their credit, they got this. The president got this, his advisors got this when they came into office, and they turned the on switch back on in terms of risk assessment and climate vulnerability. With an executive order, and when he first came into office, directing all agencies to take steps to make it easier for communities to strengthen their resilience to extreme weather. working with climate change adaptation plans for each major agency of government. How is climate change going to affect them? So the National Park Service, the Forest Service, NOAA, the Coast Guard, everyone had to start looking at this and figure out how were they going to build these threats into their strategic planning and their operations over time. He created a state, local, and tribal leaders task force on climate preparedness and resilience that issued a report last November to the federal government with a specific range of recommendations on how to incorporate climate change resilience policies into the federal regime, to remove barriers to community resilience, and to provide tools to local communities about how to grapple with this problem. He held a summit, the White House held a summit this past spring on climate change and public health with the Surgeon General of the United States there and the Medical Association, the nurses and public health officials from across the country. And they just released this past week a Climate Services for Resilient Development report with the United Kingdom, with Google, with a number of other partners, the Red Cross and others, talking about how to help build in resilience to communities in developing countries and provide some of the benefits of the platforms and the data.
To how the Defense Department and the national security community were thinking about climate change. It was very much considered a distant threat, something to think about for the future and in terms of long-term planning. It was described as a phenomena that would shape different parts of the world in different ways, in very murky manners, but something that would happen in 2020, 2030, into the distant future. So our focus in the Department of Defense in particular years ago was mostly on the likelihood that the United States might have to increase its capacity for dealing with humanitarian assistance and disaster relief issues. It was very much just seen as severe weather events happening around the world that we might have to provide assets to help respond to, but very much limited to that in terms of what would happen in the immediate future. Then the world has changed dramatically since then. What happened was, while we were describing this as a distant threat to the United States and to our security interests, the Arctic opened up dramatically faster than what the best scientific projections at the time were telling us would happen. We have areas becoming ice-free much faster than anybody would have projected 2 decades ago or even a decade ago. We have countries building up their security forces and just operating completely differently in that region now than what we had projected before as well. So this is all why the security community inside government and beyond it, in a very apolitical, nonpartisan way, has completely changed how it views security as a climate threat. It's no longer a distant thing. It's no longer an abstract threat multiplier. Our newest national security strategy and defense documents and diplomacy guidance for our State Department all describe climate change now as a direct threat to the U.S. and its core interests. Those are security, both security threats, but also to our economic prosperity and stability, to homeland security. Everything you can think of is being affected in some way by climate change. So we now speak of it as a direct threat to the United States, which is a good thing. Our instruction is to not just observe that threat and to understand it's there, but all of our federal agencies, including for some of the work that Alden and Vicki described, are really working on what do we actually do about it. And that's where the rubber really hits the road.
Climate change does not unfold on the world like a big cloud of fog. It just sort of settles in everywhere and gets into your bones. No, it's highly differentiated in how it affects communities and individuals and countries. And you can ask the question, in order to understand that, how climate change affects people, ask the question, will people have access to water, to productive land, to fish, to forests, and other natural resources as climate change deepens its hold on the human enterprise? And what is very clear is that when people do not have those resources, they move. They migrate. In some cases, they move whole communities in search of water, in search of productive lands. But they also move other ways. They move politically, and they move with governments. They move without governments. They turn first to their own governments and say, can you respond to this lack, to this challenge we have to our livelihoods, to our existence? So climate change is going to deepen. It's going to accelerate these impacts, and I'd like to give you 5 pathways through which those impacts will take hold on this planet and create threats, direct challenges to U.S. security, prosperity, and security interests, and I'd say to the world writ large. So the first of those pathways is through internal destabilization, internal instability. Christine evoked the example of Syria, the Syrian civil war. The drought began in 2006. It continued up through 2011. 2 to 3 million people moved. 1.5 million people lost their livelihoods in rural areas. And it precipitated a rural to urban migration that was a significant contributing factor to the civil war.
Relevant European security strategy that was first drafted in 2003, climate change at the time was already identified as one of the major challenges to European security. May have been forgotten, but at the time, I think Europe probably was the first entity to go to that point. And I recall that the British government at the time said that climate change was the greatest single challenge to British security. The European Union, in the still sort of guiding economic development strategy, the so-called EU 2020 strategy, clearly identifies climate change issues and issues related to climate change as one of 3 headline goals. The strategy has been summed up by saying we should develop a smart, inclusive, and sustainable economy. And sustainable alludes to mostly to climate change. And there is an ambition to have an energy union, and there might even be a chance, and it's because of conventional sort of security risks that all of a sudden it helps transforming European energy policies towards more commonality. And I think that will help transforming European policies also with regard to climate change. So I think there's a lot of change. And the one thing that I think we cannot overestimate is the announcement of the new encyclical. And I think this is really also something very new, and I think there will be a completely new dynamic up to Paris and after Paris. It's for the first time that not just the scientific elite is pushing the climate change agenda. It's also now becoming the religious leaders. It's becoming the government leaders. If you look at G7, it's becoming increasing parts of the business community. So I think there's an incipient transformation, and Europe is well part of that. So I'm not at all pessimistic.
We always like